Hello everybody, this is Philip Jonas at Kalamazoo Valley Community College presenting OpenStax Principles of Economics. And today we are going to cover section 3.2, Shifts in Demand and Supply for Goods and Services. In this module, you'll learn to identify factors that affect demand, graph demand curves and demand shifts, identify factors that affect supply, and graph the supply curves and supply shifts. So let's get started by talking about shifts in a curve, starting with the demand curve. The demand curve itself changes position when some economic factor other than the price of the product itself leads to different quantities demanded at each given price point. Now we are going to discuss these changes under the assumption of ceteris paribus, a Latin term that refers to the idea that as we are discussing changes in demand, we are assuming that everything else is staying constant. Not necessarily because that's how real life works, but rather because it lets us talk about one factor at a time. So let's start out by discussing a shift in demand by looking at a demand curve. Here is a hypothetical demand curve for cars. And right now, at a price of $20,000, we have a quantity demanded of 18 million cars. Now, first things first, let me remind you, if the price of the product itself changes, like let's say going from point Q to point R here, we would not refer to that as a change in the demand. The demand refers to that entire demand curve. Rather, we are looking at a different point on that demand curve, a different quantity demanded. But today, we want to talk about situations where even without a price change, you end up with a different quantity demanded. For example, let's say the income of car buyers increases, so that now at a price of $20,000, we've got 20 million people buying cars. Notice this combination, $20,000, 20 million cars, no longer sits on our original demand curve. That makes it a shift in the demand curve. And assuming for a second that at every other price point we are also looking at a higher quantity demanded, we would refer to this particular type of change as an increase in the demand for the product. Likewise, a separate set of circumstances, let's say a decrease in the incomes of our buyers, might lead to lower quantities at each price point. Again, starting at the $20,000 price point, let's say we're moving from point Q to point T, where buyers are now only buying 14.4 million cars. That means we have a new point not on our original demand curve. And if this is happening up and down the entire set of prices we're looking at, why, we've got ourselves a whole new demand curve, this one being referred to as a decrease in demand. Now, there is one small oddity to how we shift these demand curves. On account of the fact that we track quantities on the x-axis, when the demand for a product increases on the x-axis are shifts to the right, we end up with a demand curve that's to the right of the original. Likewise, in economics, less is going to be represented by a leftward shift, since less on the x-axis moves us to the left. It's quite possible you've spent a lifetime looking at graphs where up is more and down is less. So it might take you a minute to get used to the idea that in the model of demand and supply, right is more and left is less. We can, of course, look at this exact same scenario using a demand schedule as well. So here we've got our original demand curve represented by the column D0. If we are moving to a different price point here, that's not yet a different demand schedule. But if at the same price point, let's stick with the $20,000 example, we have an increase in how many cars are bought or a decrease, that requires us to make a whole new column here. Those what we refer to as changes in the demand for the product. Increases if there's more, decreases if there's less. Let's go ahead and one more time compare and contrast between a change in quantity demanded and a change in the demand. So a given demand curve, here's an abstract example, lets us identify at a specific price, go on over to the curve, we've got a specific quantity. If a different price happens, we're staying on the same curve. That's not a change in the demand. A change in the demand requires that at the same price point, we end up with a different quantity number. You can see this point, not on the original curve. And if it happens across the board, here we've got ourselves an increase in the demand for the product. Let's summarize the economic factors that can lead to these types of changes. So over here on the left, we're going to have the increases in demand, and over on the right, the corresponding decreases. Number one, really basic, tastes or popularity, if you will. Sometimes people just become hot. And if that happens, we end up with an increase in the demand curve, or likewise, falls out of favor. There we are, demand curve shifts to the left. There are also other factors that can change the demand for a product that are a little more quantitative, and we'll even cover some measures for those things in later sections. For example, the population that's in the market for the product might change. More population, more demand, less population, less demand. Or what about their incomes, our original example? Normally, we literally refer to this as a normal good. Higher income leads to more demand, lower income to less demand. We will also talk about special situations though, so-called inferior goods, where that relationship is reversed. There is a smaller set of products where when people lose income, they actually end up buying more of the product. And you probably want to be aware of that if you are in that market. Now, until now, I've talked about price only moving us along a demand curve. And that's correct for the price of the product we're looking at. But it is possible for the price of a different product, a related product, to change, which will lead to new quantities demanded at each price point for the product we're actually looking at. One type of such relationship is referred to as a substitute, something you might buy in order to shift away from the other product. So for example, if we are looking at the demand for battery electric vehicles and gasoline becomes more expensive. Think about that for a second. Gas gets more expensive. The incentive to buy an electric increases. We refer to this relationship as a substitute when an increase in the price of one product leads to an increase in the demand for the related product. Obviously, that can go the other way around as well. So relationship type number 2, complements. Let's say the price of that gasoline goes up. And now think about a big, heavy, gas-powered pickup truck. that probably uses a lot of gasoline. So as the price of gasoline goes up, the incentive to buy that vehicle decreases. So here we've got an increase in the price of a complement, leading to a fall in the demand of the product we are actually looking at. Because this can be a little confusing, let me repeat it one more time. The price of the product we're looking at will only move us up and down an existing demand curve. But the prices of other related products, such as complements and substitutes, can shift the demand curve of the product we are looking at. Finally, economics is a social science. We're talking about human behavior here. And that means the behavior can shift even before the underlying cause takes place, if that underlying cause can be anticipated. So for example, if you expect to lose your job, sorry about that, and you therefore anticipate lower income down the line, you might hold off on buying a car right now. That would be an expectation-based shift. Let's go ahead and talk about the analogous situation on the supply side. So here we've got ourselves a supply curve for cars, and currently at a price of $20,000, car makers are offering 18 million vehicles. If there is a change in the price of that product, you're probably getting sick of me saying it, that only moves us along the supply curve that's already there. In order to talk about a change of this supply, we need a different quantity at the same price point. So for example, let's say making cars becomes more expensive. Price of steel goes up. Now, even at the $20,000 price point, our car makers might only be willing to sell 16.5 million cars, a point L that lies outside of our original supply curve. Apply it up and down the entire supply curve, and now we're looking at a decrease in the supply of the product. Again, notice that's a leftward shift, not down. Likewise, if at the $20,000 price we see more vehicles on offer, let's say 19.8 million, we are outside of the original supply curve on point M, and this happening up and down the entire supply curve would lead to a rightward shift in supply or an increase in supply. For example, an improvement in production technology that makes it easier, faster, cheaper to make cars might lead to such an increase in the supply of vehicles. As always, let us contrast between a movement along the supply curve, J to K, versus off the supply curve, J to L or J to M. Let's go ahead and look at this in the form of a supply schedule. The original supply curve S0 here is represented as one column for each corresponding price points. Changes in the price move us to a different row on the existing supply schedule. However, should we have a change in the quantity supplied, let's stick with the $20,000 example here, leading to an increase or a decrease in the quantity supplied at that identical price point, now we've got a whole new supply schedule, and these are referred to as increases or decreases in the supply of the product. Let's also discuss this in the abstract. Here's a generic supply curve. And let's say for a given quantity of the product, here is the price that would make that happen, the so-called reservation price for our sellers. Now that reservation price has two components that we're going to pull apart far down the line. We have both the cost of producing the product plus the desired level of profit. Now, first time you see that desired profit, you think to yourself, well, I want maximum profit. Make that brace as big as you can. If only life was that easy. We're going to discuss how the desired profit ends up being a function of the next best opportunities your business has. So that's not just an arbitrary number. But for now, for today, let's talk about that cost of production. So hypothetically, if the cost of production increases, for example, that steel gets more expensive, if we now add the same desired profit on top of that number, we end up at a higher reservation price for the same quantity, outside of our original supply curve. Or applying it up and down the entire thing, there is our entire supply curve operating at a higher point because of the higher cost of production. So for the first time here, we are seeing that maybe we can talk about supply and demand curves shifting up and down rather than left or right. That would be a result of a change in a price. We're going to look at that in considerable more detail down the line. Let's go ahead and list out all the economic factors that can lead to a change in the supply of the product. Over here on the left, we've got an increase in the supply curve. Notice the rightward shift. Over here on the left, we've got a decrease in the supply curve. Notice the leftward shift. And what can get us there? Well, number one, nature itself can have an impact. Favorable conditions, increase supply. Unfavorable conditions, decrease supply. Next, we've got one component of production cost called input prices. Now, input is a very broad term in economics. It refers to everything your business needs in order to produce the product. So yes, we might be talking about a change in the price of steel. Steel literally goes inside that vehicle. But we might also talk, for example, about the cost of labor. You're going to have to pay people to assemble that vehicle. That too would be an input. Or electricity, or insurance, or many other factors you might have to pay for. Next, we have another very broad term in economics, technology. In ordinary English, we often use that word to refer to something electronic. In economics, much broader. Technology is everything we know about how to combine inputs into outputs. So it might be something as abstract as a math formula. Improvements in technology are the fundamental source of economic growth over the long haul because they allow us to get more product from the same set of inputs. So it can be sometimes difficult to distinguish between a change in input prices and a change in technology. The difference is a change in input prices refers to how much do we have to pay for every 1 unit of input. A change in technology refers to assuming those input prices are the same, ceteris paribus. Is there a change in how much of the input we need? So an improvement in technology means we need less of the input. A fall in input prices means for the same input, we're paying less price per unit. Both of those improve our cost of production. Likewise, on the decreased supply side, we might have rising input prices, but the technology story would be very uncommon here. We'd basically be talking about forgetting how to do something as a society, a sort of dark age of humanity story, perhaps for some type of historical analysis that could be interesting though. And then finally, we've got other factors that can influence the cost of production that are not directly about the production mechanics. And that's, of course, if we are looking at taxes or regulations. If those drive up the cost of production, that's very similar to the idea of input prices rising and therefore giving us a decrease in the supply of the product. That concludes our discussion of section 3.2. In this module, you learn to identify factors that affect demand, how to graph demand curves and demand shifts, as well as identify factors that affect supply and graph supply curves and supply shifts. I will see you next time.